And the first problem is to get our supplies up to Camp 4, high up in the western combe. The main obstacle is the ice fall.
The peak of Mount Everest is in contention for the single most hazardous place on the surface of the Earth. And 99 years ago, George Mallory was one of 6 climbers trying to get there. On May 19, 1922, Mallory led Howard Somerville, Edward Norton, and Henry Morshead on the first official attempt to reach the Everest summit. Across 3 days, the team trekked up the north side of the mountain, eventually reaching a record altitude of 8,225 meters before turning back. On May 24th, George Finch and Jeffrey Bruce set off on another attempt, this time making use of supplemental oxygen. On the 27th, Finch reached a new altitude record of 8,326 meters. Immediately, Mallory was eager to make his own attempt with oxygen, believing that it was his ticket to making history. While many of the exhausted climbers were hesitant to make a third attempt, Mallory's fascination with Everest had begun to turn into an obsession. On June 3rd, he convinced several climbers to follow him on a hastily improvised trek to the summit. They were joined by 14 Sherpa porters who were assisting in hauling equipment to the higher camps. The expedition was now running far too late, and the monsoon had begun dumping fresh snow on the Everest slopes. On June 7th, Mallory's party triggered an avalanche that buried 7 porters alive. The disaster would mark the immediate end of the expedition. Mallory was criticized by his peers for his recklessness, as his sudden mania for the summit had led to a severe lapse in judgment. After the failure of 1922, he would have to wait 2 more years until his next chance to conquer Everest. In the spring of 1924, the British expedition crew were back in the Himalayas. Mallory, Bruce, Norton, and Somerville had returned from the previous mission, this time being joined by newcomers Noel Odell and Sandy Irvin. Mallory was now 37, and reconciled that this expedition would likely be his last shot at reaching the world's highest peak. The May of 1924 featured historically poor weather conditions at Everest. Not wanting a repeat of the 1922 disaster, the group decided to overrule Mallory's original plan and attempt the summit without oxygen. The change frustrated Mallory, who now viewed oxygen as a necessity to reach the summit. On June 1st, Mallory and Bruce began their journey up the North Ridge. After less than a day, the pair disappointingly aborted their attempt after poor weather forced them to retreat. On June 2nd, Norton and Somerville began their attempt, this time finding themselves in ideal weather as they marched higher up the mountain. By June 4th, the pair had made it all the way up to the Great Couloir before exhaustion and respiratory problems forced them to turn around. Edward Norton reached a new altitude record of 8,570 meters, just 280 meters beneath the summit. Mallory was originally scheduled to make one last attempt with experienced climber Noel Odell, but after the failed first attempt, Mallory decided to call an audible. Instead of Odell, Mallory would make his final run to the summit alongside the 22-year-old novice Sandy Irvin, who happened to be the most skilled oxygen technician among the expedition crew. Based on this attribute, it's clear what Mallory had in mind. On June 6th, Mallory and Irvin began their ascent, each bringing with them as much oxygen as they could afford to carry. The pair were trailed by Odell, who was taking photos about 1,000 meters farther down the slope. On the evening of the 7th, Mallory wrote a final correspondence to Odell before the run to the summit, saying to look out for he and Irvin near the summit skyline the next day. On the morning of June 8th, Odell eagerly waited for visual confirmation of the climbers, but Everest Peak for the moment was obscured by mist. Then, at 12:50 p.m., there was a sudden break in the cloud cover, allowing Odell to clearly see the summit. There, Odell witnessed 2 black dots scaling one of the rock steps on the northeast ridge, with one dot appearing to climb up and over the crest, just below the final summit pyramid. After 5 minutes, the mist rolled back in, and the 2 figures disappeared behind the clouds. This small fleeting moment would be the last time that George Mallory and Sandy Irvin were ever seen alive. Shortly after the sighting, a storm hit the mountain, and the two climbers did not return from their attempt. Odell, as the closest party member, hiked up to around 8,200 meters to search for them, but after 24 hours, he signaled the rest of the crew that no trace could be found. Mallory and Irvin had been lost to the mountain. The tragedy would soon be overshadowed by the burning question looming in everyone's mind. The two climbers were on the cusp of the single greatest achievement in the history of human exploration, and no one in the world knew if they had made it. Following the 1924 Everest expedition, reporters were eager to find out whether the highest peak in the world had been reached. As the last people to see Mallory and Irvin alive, the other members of the expedition found themselves in a frenzy of media attention. Fellow climbers Odell, Norton, and Somerville were under the consensus that the pair had reached the summit. However, the greater climbing community were far more skeptical, and future Everest expeditions would begin to raise major questions over the possibility of a successful attempt. Based on the testimony from Norton and Odell, the working theory was that Mallory and Irvin were attempting to reach the summit via the crest of the Northeast Ridge, a route which at that point had never been explored. Climbers of the time lacked the knowledge or experience to truly evaluate the difficulty of the route. A major complication that Mallory and Irvin would have had to face was a geological feature on the ridge known as the second step, one of three prominent obstacles on the final run to the summit. At an altitude of 8,600 meters, the second step is a 40-meter-tall near-vertical rock face that spans across the entire width of the ridge. Initially, it was claimed to be the rock step mentioned in Odell's eyewitness report, and was supposedly surmounted by one of the climbers in just 5 minutes. However, as future expeditions examined the second step, Odell's statement began to appear more and more dubious. The first climbers to definitively explore the second step arrived in the 1933 expedition. One member described the rock face as utterly impregnable. Edmund Hillary's successful summit attempt in 1953 did not have to navigate the second step, as he reached the summit from the south side of the mountain. The first party confirmed to successfully climb the second step was the 1960 Chinese expedition, which managed to overcome the obstacle using pitons, a climbing aid which Mallory and Irvin did not have. Even with superior tools, it still took the Chinese 5 excruciating hours to complete the climb. Future expeditions would install a ladder to make surmounting the second step somewhat bearable. Historical hindsight of the second step's extreme difficulty shed serious doubt on whether Mallory or Irvin could have feasibly climbed it back in 1924. Irvin, a novice climber, was almost certainly out of his depth. Only Mallory would have had a realistic chance of navigating the obstacle, but many climbers today question whether even that would have been possible. Modern-day mountaineers now use tiered grading scales such as the Yosemite Decimal System to assess the technical difficulty of climbing features. In the century since the 1924 expedition, several experts have successfully free-climbed the second step, and have appraised the obstacle with grades ranging from 5.6 to 5.10. Based on Mallory's climbing history, his skill has been estimated at a grade of 5.9, meaning that the second step may have been just within his capabilities. However, aside from his raw aptitude, Mallory would have also had to scale the step using rudimentary gear while hauling multiple oxygen canisters. Making an unassisted climb on an unexplored obstacle under all these circumstances would have required a superhuman effort, and to do so in the 5 minutes that Odell supposedly saw, it would have to have been one of the most unlikely miracles in the history of mountain climbing. We may never know for sure what happened to Mallory and Irvin, but pretty much all of us can be confident about one thing. No one would prefer if they had failed. It's a shame that history only tends to remember the first, because so many other remarkable stories and people get lost in the fold. Whether or not Mallory and Irvin made it to the summit, the fact remains that they both gave their lives trying to push the needle of human achievement. It's chilling to consider someone spending their final moments stranded high above the clouds with no hope of rescue. You can only imagine how lonely it must feel. But in a spiritual sense, the greatest pioneers are never truly alone. While on the precipice of making history, all of mankind is with them. If they were to fail, so would the rest of us. Human beings are defined by challenging the unknown. The innate desire to explore unifies us all. We will not rest until every summit is reached and every question is answered. George Mallory put it rather succinctly back in a 1923 interview for the New York Times. When asked why he wanted to climb Everest, he simply responded with the three most famous words in mountaineering: because it's there.